Although House of the Dragon has been building up the conflict between the Hightowers and the Targaryens from the very start of the series, it's likely that the loss of Aemond's eye is where the Dance of the Dragons truly began. The build-up towards the confrontation over Aemond's mutilation is an interesting one, and the framing of the fight between all of the children was rife with subtext. The violence that the children inflict on each other was frighteningly over the top on all sides, and the broader context for all of their reactions is heartbreaking and sadly goes to show how much of the Dance of the Dragons is truly driven by crappy parenting and unresolved emotional tension. Jace and Luke haven't gotten much individual development beyond simply being strong bastards. But the trauma of both the realization of their true lineage and of losing their father and being completely unable to process or even acknowledge that is clearly terrible. Nearly killing Aemond is absurdly violent for such young children. But it's at least easier to understand in this instance because this is likely their first time truly expressing any of the trauma surrounding an issue that all of the adults around them are literally pretending isn't real. And they understandably have no idea how to handle it or express all of that pain without any guidance or support. Baela and Rhaena are in a similar situation, as it seems that their grandmother has been doing most of the emotional heavy lifting for them since their mother's death. And the loss of Vhagar has the dual brutality of losing another enormous part of their mother and losing potential equitable treatment from their father. Rhaena's rejection by Daemon has to be painful and confusing for both of them, so to so quickly lose the opportunity to finally be equal must have been extremely difficult and infuriating for both girls. And Aemond, also understanding how little value anyone of Targaryen blood seems to have if they can't ride a dragon, is finally lashing out at bullying that seems to have gone unresolved or poorly addressed for far too long. Because yes, mounting Vhagar is some king behavior, but it's also incredibly telling that a boy who is supposed to be 10 years old at this point was willing to risk literal death in order to become a dragon rider. And it goes to show how early on, anyone of Targaryen blood learns that they have no inherent value to the rest of their family if they don't have a dragon. So as scary as it was to see all of the children go full Lord of the Flies, it is not surprising that all of this unresolved tension finally messily and violently exploded. And it's tragic that the consequences for all of their outbursts had such permanent effects on Aemond. But the way that the situation is handled afterward is likely where the war truly began. The confrontation over Aemond's mutilation is fascinating and so rich with subtext that it's almost impossible to pick up on everything that's happening for every character in the moment. One of the most interesting aspects of the argument is something that anyone who hasn't read the books would clearly miss. When Rhaenyra discovers that Aemond has called her sons bastards, she demands that Aemond be questioned sharply about where he heard these rumors. In A Song of Ice and Fire, questioning someone sharply is a euphemism for torturing someone for information. It's not a term that comes up outrageously often, but it's never used to refer to anything aside from that. For example, in A Clash of Kings, Jon 5, Mormont and Qhorin Halfhand are discussing a wildling who is questioned for information. And Qhorin says, "He was questioned perhaps too sharply, and died with much unsaid." In another instance, Daenerys is discussing the interrogation of criminals with the Shave Pate in A Dance with Dragons, Daenerys 2, and they have this exchange. "I have changed my mind. Question the man sharply." "I could. Or I could question the daughters sharply whilst the father looks on. That will wring some names from him." So suffice it to say, being questioned sharply is not a pleasant experience. It's torturous interrogation that can be brutal enough to kill someone. Meaning that before Aemond's empty eye socket is even done being sewn up, she is asking that her 10-year-old brother be further brutalized for saying something that is essentially an open secret and that he arguably doesn't even have the full capacity to understand the importance of. In the same vein, the lack of care that Viserys shows for Aemond is truly astonishing. He's a horrifically wounded and now permanently disabled child, and Viserys' only concern is where Aemond actually heard this rumor. And instead of telling his absentee father that up until 30 minutes ago he had two entire eyes and that's how he figured it out, he is clearly considering whether or not to out his mother for being the one to introduce him to this idea. And the interplay between Alicent, Aemond, and Aegon in this moment is really fantastically done without saying anything at all. It's interesting, because while Alicent was clearly in the wrong to discuss the illegitimacy of Jace and Luke with her children, both because none of the children deserve to have the burden of this issue put on themselves, and because the open acknowledgement of their bastardy actually puts Alicent's own children in danger. This is likely the first time that Aemond is fully realizing that his mother's concerns about the threat that Jason Luke's parentage could pose to Aemond and his siblings is completely true. Clearly, given that this knowledge can put the children in physical danger, it was insane for Alicent to inform them of this before they were mature enough to understand it and keep their mouths shut. But she definitely wasn't wrong about the danger that Rhaenyra's children could pose to her own. There is no way that any of the children are fully capable of understanding the seriousness of the situation at this point. But Aemond having to confront the fact that he has been horribly mutilated, that literally no one besides his mother seems to even be concerned about his injury, and that there is the potential that he'll be hurt even further for mentioning Jason Luke's illegitimacy, is an enormous reality check about his standing with everyone in that room. He might be the king's son, but no one besides Alicent is even acting as if something bad or unfair has happened to him. And there's a clear implication that he might actually be punished for what he said, while no one is seemingly going to be punished for cutting his eye out. Throwing Aegon under the bus was low-key hilarious and more than deserved after all of Aegon's terrible behavior. But it's interesting to see Aegon and Aemond both wordlessly rally to protect their mom. Of course, there's likely an element of them both caring for her and not wanting to get her in trouble. But I can't imagine that it evaded their notice that in a room full of the most powerful adults in Westeros, Alicent was literally the only person advocating for them at all. And once again, that must have been a brutal reality check for both of them, and is likely a contributing factor as to why they covered for her. It was incredibly inappropriate for Alicent to stoke any fears about Jason Luke for her own children. And all of the parents suck for putting their kids in this position. But this is also the first time that Alicent's children probably realize that their mother was not only telling them the truth, but that the danger that they're in as a result of it was very serious. From the beginning, it seemed as if Aegon liked the strong boys better than he ever liked Aemond, and yet he follows suit with his younger brother, probably because he very abruptly realized, if any of the people with power in this situation have to choose, they'll protect Jason Luke at his expense. It's actually fascinating to see how quickly things turn around for all of Alicent's children. The scene literally begins with Jace, Luke, and Aemond squabbling like children would despite the severity of the situation. And by the end, Aemond is the one comforting his mother because he has come to the realization that if the situation isn't ameliorated, then his mother and his siblings are likely the ones who are going to suffer for it. They have all been very abruptly thrust into the realities of adulthood because they're being forced to recognize that being their father's least favorite kids can have very real and dangerous consequences for them. And what's actually interesting is that despite being in denial for more than half of her life at this point, Alicent probably snaps because she realizes the same thing. She realizes that her father was always right and that if she has any hopes for herself or her children having any kind of livable life, she is the one who's going to have to fight for it. She can't rely on anyone else's charity or expect that being an obedient lady, wife, queen, or mother is going to yield the results that the world always told her it should. Clearly, lashing out at Luke and demanding an eye in return is insane, but lashing out at Rhaenyra and Viserys was a near inevitability. All Alicent really needed was exactly what she got, which was an object lesson in the reality that Viserys and Rhaenyra do not care about the welfare of her children and will throw them under the bus to save themselves or those that they do care about. Rhaenyra literally looked at the ripped open face of her 10-year-old brother and demanded that he be tortured for information to find out where he had heard that the strong boys were bastards, as if he didn't have 2 whole-ass eyeballs 30 minutes ago and just figured it out himself. And what's worse is Viserys went along with it. Viserys is undeniably a pushover. But as soon as Rhaenyra points out that Aemond was mutilated because he called her sons bastards, Viserys literally looked into Aemond's remaining eye and asked him where he heard this rumor before asking if his now disabled son was even okay. It's not as if his favoritism towards Rhaenyra is news to any of Alicent's children, but the level of deadbeat dadding here is truly beyond comprehension. And to add insult to literal injury, Viserys simply says that everyone needs to apologize to each other, and if anyone speaks of Jason Luke's bastardy again, they'll be losing their tongues too. Alicent likely wanted to believe that at the very least Rhaenyra likely wouldn't harm her own family, but her reaction to Aemond pretty clearly demonstrated that this wasn't the case. And that, along with the complete inaction of everyone around them, likely illustrated to Alicent that the price of Rhaenyra taking the throne was not something she was willing to pay, and if she was going to fight for her own children, that she was going to have to do it herself. There are dozens of contributing factors and people stoking the flames of this conflict. But Alicent's total freakout was the culmination of everything that she has tried to ignore and has pretended wasn't real, exploding into her reality all at once. Being the wife of the king isn't going to protect her. Having the children of the king isn't going to protect them. And regardless of whatever love once existed between them, she can't bet the lives of herself and her children on Rhaenyra's kindness. Because if Rhaenyra has to choose between Alicent's family and herself or her own children, she'll throw them under the bus to save herself. The war is about far more than just Alicent and Rhaenyra. But this moment is likely the incident that made war an inevitability in Alicent's mind. Alicent has clearly been preparing herself for war for a very long time now, but it seems like Aemond's mutilation was the moment that Alicent decided that she had no other options outside of going to war. The Dance of the Dragons was begun by literal squabbling children, and Aemond's lost eye was the point of no return for Alicent. But what do you think? Was Aemond's eye the true start of the war? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.